Hey everyone, this is Jim Hefner with Hefner Health Physical Therapy and the Student Physical Therapist. And in this video, I'm going to talk about our human movement system. We'll get into how movement relates to pain, what are some of the most fundamental movement principles that you should understand, and sort of how our body is designed to best move or most efficiently move in certain ways. So, movement by definition, human movement is achieved by a complex and highly coordinated mechanical interaction between bones, muscles, ligaments, joints within the musculoskeletal system under the control of the nervous system. And there is a few key points to this definition. One, it's complex, it's highly coordinated, and there's this mechanical interaction, which means that physical stresses go through our body, and how we utilize those stresses depends on how much force production we get out of the movement, and also how much force goes into our body and into our tissues. And that doesn't directly relate to pain, at least as the research shows, but that has to have some sort of implication, at least from a metabolic energetic perspective. If we're not using the forces that are going through our body from a kinetic energy standpoint, then those forces need to be absorbed within the body. And that physical stress and the repetitive physical stress definitely takes a toll on the body in some way. And that's what we're going to get into today. So the human movement system, the three main systems within the body that we use for movement are the muscular system, the neural system, and the skeletal system. On the muscular side, we're looking at tissue strength and flexibility primarily. So how much can the tissue elongate and how much can it contract and shorten? And what's the range within that of how much control you have? And that control is really coordinated by the nervous system. So the recruitment of muscle activation, refinement, the motor control, all of those things coordinate with our muscular system to make sure that when you pick up a cup of water, you don't squeeze the heck out of it. They're able to smoothly and in a coordinated fashion execute that motion. And lastly, the skeletal system is sort of your structural foundation where we get force and torque production from. So if you have strong muscular system and neural system, but you don't have the proper structural setup for it, you're not going to be able to leverage those things as well to get the most efficient movement. Looking at those a little bit more in depth with our skeletal and joint system, the skeletal structure is connected through this dense ligamentous network. So bones are all held together through joint capsules, through a lot of different ligaments that maintain the integrity of from bone to bone, and that makes up our joint structure. And so the ligaments are made of collagen and they need to maintain a certain level of elasticity. So those ligaments help maintain the optimal sort of centered joint position, which then gives the muscles the best angles to pull from. And that's really important. So if I slouch down like this and my shoulder rolls forward, then as I raise my arm up overhead, we're going to catch some mechanical impingement, which puts more force through the rotator cuff. Whether or not that extra force causes pain or injury, well, then that's a much more complex question. But it's important to know that how you're moving is going to impact what sort of stresses are going through the body and through the tissues. So the skeletal system uses the ligaments to help maintain your structure, and then that allows for a better or more efficient force production through the body, meaning that you can take in elastic energy, let's say when you're walking, and use that to put energy back out versus that energy going right into your bones, into your joints. Next, we have the muscular system, which uses tension to help generate elastic energy. And I have a whole other lecture on kind of the different types of energy that go through the body, but elastic energy is the temporary storage of energy that then is quickly released. And then we don't use as much actual metabolic energy to execute a movement. It would be the example of when you perform a jumping motion as you load the tendons, that quick loading energy is held in the tendon to then explode and push off. Energy isn't lost there because it's just transferred in and out of the tissue. Now, let's say you go down and do a jumping motion and hold there at the bottom. Now, all of a sudden, your muscles need to work in that new range. They're holding the energy, and then that energy is absorbed into the body, so it becomes more thermal energy. And that's why if you hold a squat for a while, you can start to feel the heat building up in your body. elastic energy turns into thermal energy, and then that changes what's happening, and it changes how the tissues have to work to absorb that movement. So synergistic muscle patterns are connected via the connective tissue. So muscle to muscle, as I do a pec fly type of motion, I use all the muscles from here through the bicep, through the forearm, and into the wrist flexors. So all of those need to work together to help complete the movement. And those lines of muscles are connected, you could say fascially, but they're connected even more just from, like, as the muscle tapers into the tendon, the outer layer of that, the epimysium of the muscle tendon structure, then has connections up the chain, both neurologically and fascially, to help complete a movement most efficiently. So summarizing that, the muscular system uses the connective tissue to transfer force and maintain elastic energy. Let's go back to the skeletal system real quick. Your skeletal system uses the ligaments to maintain structure. The muscular system uses the connective tissues to transfer that force appropriately. And then lastly, the neural system is the one that kind of puts it all together. From your periphery all the way through the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord, the nervous system is all connected, meaning that input or information in one area is going to transmit and impact or give feedback to the entire system, or the connected chain of the system. So even something that happens down in your toes, that signal is going to travel from your toes up the back of the leg to the sciatic nerve into the spinal cord to your brain, where it needs to be interpreted. The nervous system travels and sort of winds through the muscles and the connective tissue. It wraps around the bones, and it provides you both with the sensation of what you're feeling, so your tactile sense of touch, but then also your muscle function. So this afferent-efferent response gives you both the sensation and the motor output that's necessary for movement. So the nervous system is the control system which organizes the skeletal and muscular systems together to help execute the most efficient and optimal movement. Now, you might say, okay, you're repeating yourself a lot on we need to have efficient movement, and these are the systems that are involved. But let's talk about those three systems in relation to how the human body, or the structural organization of the body, is made up. One thing is that in both the arms and the legs, we have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 joint alignment, or bony joint alignment. And what that means is, from in the upper body, the humerus, and in the lower body, the femur, you have one major bone that connects off the main skeleton. Then you have, as you work your way down, radius and ulna in the forearm, and then tibia and fibula in the lower leg. So you can see that the structure is going from less bone into more dynamic and more complex movements as it goes into the feet and into the hands. Then we go into the hands, we have all of the major hand bones down into the metacarpals for the upper body. And then in the lower body, we have the same with the tarsal bones down into the metatarsals. And that's what, with the humerus, we need to complete a wide range of movements and through a large range of motion. But with that motion, there needs to be a lot of control and a lot of input right back to the body. So we need to be stable through the most proximal joints, and that's why there's less bones there. And then we need to be more mobile or more dynamic as we get further away from our body. So the shoulder needs to stabilize, so then the hand can be used for prehensile and grasping type activities. And that setup is the same for the upper body and the lower body. So what that implies then is that the muscles that are around the humerus are going to be different than the muscles that are around the metacarpals. They're going to be different in structure and in function. And if we're not using the structure and function appropriately, then we're going to be using the tendons of the forearm for something that the upper body, or the more stronger proximal muscles, needs to be doing. So the upper limb is more mobile, the lower limb is stronger. And that's because they serve different purposes. The upper limb is going to be concerned with more of your grasp, manipulation, prehension activities, where the lower limb is really responsible for locomotion, for movement for a long period of time. The upper limb has a whole set of muscles. There's 17 muscles that attach onto the shoulder blade or the scapula. and those are responsible for moving and positioning the shoulder girdle relative to the trunk. The lower body is fixed to the pelvis, and then that's securely fixed to the vertebral column. So the amount of movement and how that movement supports the body is going to be largely different for the lower body versus the upper body, just based on the degrees of freedom and how that connects back to the core of the body. With this, we've kind of talked around this already, but our function follows our form. So we have certain muscle, like you can see from the serratus anterior to the hamstrings to the outer glute muscle, that each one has different fiber orientation, different length of the muscle, different muscle belly to tendon length, different so we said like the directional orientation of the fibers as well. And all of those things are very important for how they help stabilize the body. Built within that, we have our local or one joint muscles, and then we have our global multi-joint muscles. So let's take the TFL, the hip flexor, which flexes and medially rotates the hip. That's kind of on the front outer part of the body. Well, when someone goes into femoral internal rotation, so this muscle right here, if someone always hangs out in femoral internal rotation, that muscle then is getting stressed, and now it's positioned more anteriorly. So if you use that TFL as a primary hip flexor, well, all of a sudden the form is going to start adapting to that functional, like that the direction of how you're using the muscle, and then everything else down the chain is going to follow suit. And then all of a sudden you have this accessory hip flexor muscle, which runs down through the IT band and inserts into the knee, that is then being used a lot more versus counterbalancing it with the glutes and with the iliopsoas complex. So things need to work in a certain manner, and when those aren't happening, of course the body can adjust and adapt, and it's very resilient at doing that for a long time. But eventually it's going to give you the feedback of, hey, we're leveraging this muscle, we're borrowing motion from elsewhere because we're not utilizing the capacity of that muscle kind of as it's designed to be used. So the local one joint muscles, they are important for stabilizing the spine, providing localized joint stability, and they're great at creating stiffness around joints. So to almost like guard and protect, or to help bring deep stability within the joint. So you have that, and then you have these longer, more global muscles like the tendons of the hand, which run all the way from here down past many joints of the hand. And that is more important for a combination of movements. And so those help move, position, and organize the periphery and the trunk of the body. And it's important to know these, because if you're trying to use certain muscles and neglecting some of the deeper stabilizers, then the setup of how the body is trying to move throughout the environment is not going to be as efficient. And when it's not as efficient, that requires a lot more energy. And that energy might not matter on a pain standpoint of, if you do this, it's going to cause pain. But where it does matter is that if you're using that pattern repetitively, let's say you're running with that TFL example, and you didn't sleep as much last night, and your nutrition's been off, and you've been sitting a lot because you're working, all of those stresses go into the same bucket. And if we add more physical stress on it, that stress is going to go through the joint in a different way. And the cumulative effect of it, then maybe that plays a role into how one experiences pain. With that, we just talked about the organization of the body, and now I want to talk about some of the mechanical efficiency that's also built into it. And it relates directly back to that organizational piece. So there is a most efficient way, or a mechanically efficient way, to move. And the human body is this complex system of levers, pulleys, pumps, processors. We have so much kind of innately built in that is designed for a reason. And if we're not using that, we're gonna see and feel different results from things. And what that means is we have our bones, which form like the rigid skeletal frame of our architecture. The joints kind of act as our pivot points. The muscles generate the force and tension. And the tendons are sort of like this force transfer, the intermediary between the bones and the muscles. And if you aren't using your tendons as effectively as you should, then the muscles are going to take on a lot more force. The tendons are going to transfer a lot more energy into the bone. Bone that is receiving a lot more input over and over again is Wolff's law, so it lays down more bone, and then that leads to arthritic changes, which leads to stiffness, which leads to altered movement patterns. Now, it doesn't cause pain necessarily, but it has an important sequelae of events that follow not appropriately using those levers as they're designed. So movement should utilize that built-in levers and pulleys. So if you have poor technique, it's going to be poor energy transfer through the body, which is ultimately going to change how your health and fitness is. And health and fitness in a way of if it feels stiff to do something, you're going to use a different path of least resistance to try to work around whatever stiffness or tightness is present. The subtle changes in body position alter the forces that are generated by the body and then therefore impact how our body adapts over time. Mechanical advantage is appropriately using that lever system that we have to decrease the workload that goes through our tissues. The goal should be to minimize the physical stresses that go through the body by maximizing quality movement. And quality movement doesn't mean perfect posture, but it means using lines or chains of muscles together so that no individual part is taking on too much strain repetitively. Within this mechanical efficiency conversation, we need to think about where our center of balance is at, and then our center of gravity or our center of mass. The center of gravity in let's say a normal person, whatever that means, is roughly kind of right below the navel. So it's at 58% of your body height is where that center of mass is at. And that's important because then when you are pushing off the ground with each step while you're walking, when you push off and then the forces from the ground go up through your leg into your body, they need to distribute around your center of mass so that you're not moving too much laterally or you're not moving too much vertically. If you do, you're either going to lose energy momentum of the movement, or that stress is going to go into the tissues, and then repetitive stress into the tissues just causes more workload for the body, more metabolic energy for the body to absorb. Keeping your center of gravity over your midfoot is also a great example of being mechanically efficient. The subtalar joint in the foot, which controls the pronation and supination or eversion and inversion of the foot, when someone drops into more pronation, they drop into tibial internal rotation, femoral internal rotation, and that doesn't allow for adequate force production up through the SI joints into the low back. I can't stress enough that alone doesn't cause the pain part of it, but it is a lot weaker posture for your body to try to maintain. It's weaker because those muscles aren't as well designed as the glutes and the low core to hold your skeletal system into position. And then if you're repetitively using one pattern, the opposite pattern gets weakened or pulled on. When you're not over your center of balance, we start inducing extra unnecessary levers into the system. That would be if I'm raising my arm up overhead, I need to use the shoulder blade muscles of the serratus anterior, the low trap, in conjunction with the rotator cuff and then the muscles of the arm and glenohumeral joint. That all needs to happen together in a coordinated fashion, or else if I am not using those, then I'm going to start adapting, adding extra levers or extra forces through the body that create like literal mechanical impingements, or where there's not enough space for the tissues to operate. And when the muscle is getting pressed on as it's trying to activate, it can't perform its function of stabilization or movement as efficiently. And then lastly on this, if we kind of take an evolutionary viewpoint of it, the human spine has a lot higher pelvic incidence than earlier upright species. And what that means is if you look at the left versus the right, on the right side, that's kind of our human spine, which is a sinusoidal curve. The natural lordosis of the spine allows for a lot more resistance to the torque that is required through walking. So as you walk, The pelvis needs to go back and forth, so one leg forward, the other leg forward, and the spine needs to adapt to those stresses. By having some lumbar lordosis, it allows the control of those forces, like through your lumbar facet joints, to be a lot more stable and less impactful on the joints of the spine. A lower pelvic incidence, which is on the left side where the lordosis is absent, and so there's decreased lordosis, you have more of an anterior or forward line of gravity, and that puts a lot more stress then through the vertebral column and the head and the neck. And especially if you need to be looking upright so that you can see what's out in front of you from a safety standpoint. If you're a lot more forward because you're lacking the lumbar lordosis or that pelvic incidence, then there's going to be a hell of a lot more stress that goes through your upper back. Whereas on the right side, if you are, utilizing some of the natural curves of the spine, then we're able to buffer some of the stresses, and we're able to use some of the natural elasticity and patterning of the spine. All of that will take us into the last part of this conversation, which is some movement fundamentals and principles. So the principles can be applied to hopefully all of your clients, and with the goals of maximizing physical performance, so maximizing strength and power output, while also minimizing physical stress that goes into the tissues, which might minimize your risk of getting injured. So some movement fundamentals and principles is we know, and it's been said 1,000 times over, that there's no best posture, but I do want you to know that some postures are stronger than others. So like there is no, and it's not bad to slouch, but it might be stronger to be upright. There's no bad movements, but there are some movements that are less stable than others. So if I'm standing in a lot of hip internal rotation knee valgus, that inherently isn't going to cause pain, but it also doesn't allow your pelvis to maintain in a neutral position, and it doesn't allow your glutes to work as well, which then doesn't hold your body up as efficiently. And so it's not that the movement is bad, but some movements are just naturally a lot more stable because how they circumferentially protect your joints. I think we went wrong somewhere in the pain science conversation of saying that movement and pain, poor movement does not cause pain, but poor movement does cause physical stress to the body, which causes you to move differently because of stiffnesses and tightnesses that then has an impact on other things in your life, or it's a contributing factor with a bunch of other factors in your life. So what I say is identifying what is the most efficient movement strategy is very important. And an example of that would be with this person, the picture here. If I'm trying to stretch someone's hip flexors and they go into a half kneeling position and then lean their body forward, well, how someone might want to adapt to that based on how they're already moving is that instead of maintaining the inline front hip mobility, they're going to go into thigh adduction. They're going to hike their opposite hip up, which compresses through the spine. And there's subtle ways that then no longer is that stretch going for the intended action of actually stretching the hip flexors, but instead it's creating extra tensions and stresses up and down the chain that are not only less efficient from a physical capacity standpoint, but it also just offloads stress and sort of puts tension into other parts of the body. So movement is key. Movement diversity or variability of movement is very important, but also the knowing what's moving and what's connected and what's the goal of each movement is equally important. So for every movement, there's a most efficient pathway. If that pathway isn't available, let's say it's not available because of tightness or weakness that's present, or like environmental constraints of being able to do something, then the body is very redundant. It'll do whatever it's required to do to complete a movement. So if I need to pick up something heavy off the ground, the most efficient way to do that is to get my hips back, use my posterior chain, use the tension through the hamstrings and the glutes to load the pattern, because then I'm using the biggest muscles to pick up whatever I need to. I can also, bend forward and use my spine to do it. And that'll work for a lot of reps. and maybe it'll work forever for some people, but it then instead of using these powerful muscles that are right there in the glutes, we're now trying to use our erector spinae muscles, so these other muscles that run all the way up and down the spine. We're taking on a lot more tension there, which, like the spine, there's a lot more vertebrae to control. There's a lot more movement that needs to be maintained and sustained. Whereas it's not bad, but we're just gonna you can use different strategies, but there is likely a stronger, more effective pattern to complete many movements. Going back to that last statement, yes, there's a most efficient, effective pattern, and that efficient, effective pattern maximizes the length tension relationship of the joints. When I slouch down through here, the glenohumeral joint rolls into internal rotation. As that rolls into internal rotation, the pec shortens, and then the pec minor attaches onto the shoulder blade, which pulls the shoulder blade anteriorly too. As that's getting pulled anteriorly, then I'm losing some stability function in the back. So as I raise my arm up overhead, let's say I've been here for a long time, the ability to go back into that opposite movement is going to be limited because the length tension balance of the muscles has been altered. Now it adapts this new position of tightness here and then length in the back, and stiffness in one area typically doesn't lend to opening up in the opposite pattern. So as I draw short here, I'm loading everything on the front side, and that takes away from the ability to activate. It's like if you don't use it, you lose it from a muscle standpoint, because we're not retraining that muscle memory. So having diverse movement of here and then also there, going through the range is very important. We see a lot of clients who only end up here, and then as they reach back, they try to go there, but instead it maybe ends up more across there or across the upper shoulder into the neck. And that's where we lose the length tension relationship, and things don't work as well. They don't function as mechanically efficient as they should. When a joint remains centered, the muscles surrounding the joint can offer real stability while maintaining the degrees of freedom. That means as I raise my arm up overhead, I can get that full range here because I'm not getting any other pull that's taking it out of one of the degrees of freedom. And then lastly, a larger range of controlled motion is a larger sphere of resiliency to injury. And what that means is that the more you practice bigger and bigger ranges of motion, the more stresses that you can handle through more degrees of freedom, and then you can offload tension or stress into other patterns before that hits the end range of your tissue strength. Essentially, the more controlled range of motion that you have, the less likely you are to get injured, with the exception of maybe some traumatic or some uncontrolled situational accidents. What that says is that movement quality is important, and movement quality is maximizing the efficiency while minimizing the stress on the tissue. If a certain part of the body is stiff, immobile, weak, has scar tissue, etc., mechanical stress is transferred into the tissues with that movement then. So instead of it being equally distributed throughout the whole body, it goes into a tissue and it stops there, and then that the body has to absorb energy at that level, which requires a lot of metabolic demand, meaning over and over again the body has to work to distribute those forces, and if it has trouble doing that, then inflammation will present, or the overuse syndromes will happen. People will offload tension that they can't control. So as this gentleman in the picture is walking, clearly he's leaning forward, he's off to his right side a bit, he's offloading something because of a stiffness or a tightness. Those movement compensations or deviations that the body does is an example where the body is not able to use the tension appropriately. And that means that as he's walking, there should be some transfer of elastic energy from side to side. And most likely as he walks, there's an abrupt stop, like kind of a rigid halt of the movement, where then the force either goes somewhere through the lower extremity up into the lower back area. Whether or not that causes lumbar pain or SI joint pain or hip pain, I don't know. It's that becomes the individual's subjective nature of pain, and then how we each choose to offload based on a number of factors. So when there's injury to a muscle group, the brain and body react by trying to reduce the forces that cause that pain. We're always going to try to offload or avoid the things that are feeling the gradual stresses. For this reason, I say proximal is always involved. And that is true from a neurological standpoint. Proximal is involved if someone's having plantar fascia pain. I look at the whole neurological chain from the medial and lateral plantar nerves through the tibial nerve up to the sciatic nerve. That whole chain is involved because not only is it neurologically programmed, but then also the from distal, let's say I'm not able to roll through my foot into dorsiflexion to then get my body over it. Well, I'm going to shorten how my hip flexor works. I'm going to change how my glute works. Everything up to I'm probably going to offload through my lumbar spine because of what's happening down below. So proximal is always involved, and that means proximal always needs to be retrained as part of the conversation, because pain is a whole body state of dysfunction or injury. Even though one muscle or one body region takes on the pain, that pain becomes it impacts the whole system, the whole structure, meaning that it's going to impact your emotional state and your mood, and it's going to impact how all the muscles up the chain are working, because it can't stabilize or naturally do what it needs to do where the site of injury is at. Other movement principles and fundamentals: weakness and tightness are mutually dysfunctional. And what that means is that weakness causes tightness and tightness causes weakness. So muscular tightness is often due to dysfunctional or improper stabilization that causes the movers to shorten and not work as well. So like things are, if something is weak and something is tight, there's always this question of, well, which one do I address first, or which one serves a greater purpose? I would change that conversation to, we need to target both of those together, and whatever the most active, engaged process for the client that's not increasing their pain or their threshold level is going to be the right solution. So maybe on somebody who's getting pulled forward through their shoulder where the pec is tight, if they're highly irritable, likely some manual therapy stuff to open up the shoulder that way is going to be the first line of defense. Yes, obviously, if we can just work right away on dynamic trap strengthening and serratus anterior stuff, that's great. But irritability level is going to dictate sort of where we need to start. But the most important part is that those two things happen together. When one happens, the other happens. It's not like you have a tight pull on the front side that doesn't impact how the trap responds on the back. They are one and the same, and we need to work on both sides of those and train both sides of the joint, because even though the injury might be somewhere, how the pattern of it works is really like what's creating and feeding into the whole body state of dysfunction of it. That last statement is kind of why stretching alone is insufficient, because if you just stretch, we're missing the other strengthening piece or the balance stabilization piece that's equally as important. Lastly, under load, our tissues need to be able to generate stiffness or tension, and a tension meaning a good muscular tension. And that is going to minimize strain on the joints or the soft tissue. For this reason, being able to isometrically hold a position and also dynamically hold something as your body's going through a range of motion is really important for stability, which means like it's very important for the stress that goes through the joint or the tissue at each level. If I turn my body there and I'm reaching back to grab something behind me, if the core doesn't, if the obliques don't help with that rotation, so I'm engaging and then turning my body over my hip, the hip is going into internal rotation on the side I'm turning to, and then the spine is right rotation, so the right facet joints are closing down, the left ones have to open up a bit. If I don't engage my core, I'll sort of naturally collapse through the spine, and then the spine, the bones take on a lot more stress. If I engage the core, that energy is absorbed through the muscles, or it's transferred from the muscles into the bones, and there's a lot more gradual stress that happens in the tissues versus it all going right into the facet joints. That is a very important concept because being able to hold position places minimizes where the strain goes through the tissue. Since we're built for efficiency, our habitual movement patterns develop very quickly. And that's sort of like what muscle memory is. So if you are always working on your computer and you're slouching and your head's getting drawn forward, your brain, your nervous system says, hey, this is where we need to be. So we need to work on getting stronger in that position, or we're going to start holding tension in that position. The issue with that is as it becomes more specific in one direction, it becomes less specific in a different direction. There was a great quote I heard a long time ago that was, whenever you're training for something, you're detraining for something else. And that sort of applies here to whenever you develop single postural habits, and that can either be slouched or it can be rigidly standing up tall in a quote unquote good posture. Well, that then is making you less dynamic in other postures. So this really matters based on what someone's goals and life activities and everything requires. But know that how you posture yourself is likely going to indicate what's tight, what's strong, the total available range of motion that someone has. And what the key is to create a diverse movement and training routine, a one that gets the major joints and the major muscles of the body both moving and active. So active in a way that creates stability around it, but also promotes flexibility through a range of motion. Then when your body goes into a position, the joint receptors have been there before, the muscles know how to respond, and it's a coordinated reaction out of it versus going into something your joint doesn't know what to do. It locks out, something else moves and creates extra stress up the chain. Resilience is the word that I would look for. So resilient with movement outside of one's comfort zone is really like where we need to be for movement, for injury prevention. All right, so in future videos, I'm going to talk more about other movement training principles, the need to go slow before we go fast with training, how to integrate more sensory information, because better afferent raw information to the central nervous system will allow for better processing and efferent motor response out. We're going to talk about simple to complex with training of it. I want to work on, if someone's having knee pain when they squat, I want to unload them a bit and give them like a TRX sort of assisted squat first. If that hurts, I want to get them on the table and retrain hip flexion, knee flexion, and ankle dorsiflexion through an unloaded pattern. So like working on the mechanics of it, going simple before we add complexity and more elements to a movement. And then also talk about open versus closed chain and how that impacts the sensory motor system, and then how it also impacts capacity and specific functional training. Also, I'm going to have videos on other specific synergistic patterns, or how connected lines of tension work together that will help minimize one's risk of injury. We're going to go into the physical stress theory and how stress that goes into the body impacts certain tissues in different ways. Arthritis would be a great example of this. If someone's knees are taking on a lot of stress because the relationship between the quads and the hamstrings, or the quads and the glutes, is not in balance, forces are going to go through the knee. Bone that absorbs more and more force is Wolff's law, where it lays down more bone. And that's essentially what arthritic changes are. So knowing how physical stresses impact the nerves, impact the bones, impact the muscles and connective tissue, it happens to each one differently. And that is somewhat based on that structural organization of the body. And lastly, we're going to talk about the importance of core strength. Today, we talked about mechanical efficiency and bringing the core into the equation. Like the core is where your center of mass is at. So being strong and dynamic through your core will then allow you to buffer stresses that happen from proximal out distally. Well, I hope you enjoyed that overview kind of on the movement system and our movement principles and foundational concepts of movement. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me at jim@hefnerhealth.com or studentphysicaltherapist@gmail.com.